The Palace of Seven Moons had never felt so large. Princess-Queen Aerith walked through corridors designed for processional gatherings and found only echoes. The marble floors gleamed under automated lighting systems that no longer needed to accommodate hundreds of staff members. The tapestries depicting 800 years of her family's rule hung on walls that no one observed. Everything was perfectly maintained and completely empty. 1 week ago, she'd been a queen. Technically, she supposed she still was, though the title felt more like an accusation than an honor now. 1 week ago, the emergency parliamentary session had stripped her of executive authority pending investigation into the corruption that had hollowed out her government from within. 1 week ago, she'd learned that every person she'd trusted, her regent council, her military advisors, her senior administrators, had been stealing from the treasury, falsifying reports, and leaving her to sign documents she'd believed were honest. She'd been ruling since she was 20, since her parents died in what was supposed to be a routine diplomatic shuttle trip. 3 years of trying to lead a planet while men twice her age smiled and told her everything was fine, that she just needed to trust their expertise, that young queens should focus on ceremonial duties and let experienced advisors handle complex governance. They'd been robbing the planet blind while she signed their approvals with naive trust. Now most of them had fled to neighboring systems to avoid prosecution. The few who remained were in detention awaiting trial. And Aerith stood in the center of a palace that had lost almost all its staff in 7 days, some dismissed by the emergency parliament, most simply abandoning ship before they could be associated with her failed regime. She touched her ears reflexively, noting the absence of the traditional jewelry that marked royal authority. She'd removed it herself on the 3rd day, when it became clear she had no authority left to mark. The simple tunic and trousers she wore now made her look more like a university student than a queen, which felt appropriate given how thoroughly her attempt at governance had collapsed. "Ma'am." A voice from the corridor entrance made her turn. "Your afternoon schedule is clear. Did you want me to arrange access to the gardens, or would you prefer to remain in your quarters?" Corporal Marcus Webb stood at attention, his Earth Defense Coalition uniform precisely maintained despite the chaos of the past week. He'd been assigned to her personal guard 6 months ago as part of a cultural exchange program between Thalraxis and Earth. She'd expected the usual military stiffness, the professional distance that treated royalty as valuable objects rather than people. Instead, Marcus had learned her name, not just her title, by the end of the first day. He'd asked about her interests, her concerns, the weight of responsibilities she carried. He'd treated her like a person who happened to be queen rather than a queen who happened to be vaguely person-shaped. And he was still here, despite having every reason to request immediate reassignment. "You don't have to keep doing this," Aerith said, not for the first time this week. "Your posting was to guard the Princess Queen during official functions." "I don't have official functions anymore. I barely have a kingdom." Marcus relaxed slightly from attention, though his posture remained professional. "My orders were to guard the Princess Queen. Those orders haven't been rescinded. So unless you're formally dismissing me, ma'am, this is still my posting. I don't have the authority to dismiss anyone anymore. The Parliament controls everything now. Then I suppose I'll remain until they tell me otherwise." Marcus's expression was carefully neutral, but Aerith caught something in his tone, determination, maybe, or stubbornness. "The gardens are quite nice this time of day. The automated systems are still maintaining them perfectly." Aerith felt a laugh bubble up, slightly hysterical. "Yes, the gardens are maintained. The palace is clean. All the systems function perfectly. It's just the government that collapsed." "Governments collapse regularly," Marcus observed. "It's practically a historical tradition, but gardens are resilient. They tend to outlast the political systems that created them." It wasn't comfort, exactly. Marcus was too honest to offer false comfort, but it was perspective, and Aerith found herself grateful for it. "The gardens, then. At least there I can pretend to have a purpose. They walked through empty halls, their footsteps loud in the silence. Aerith tried to remember when she'd last heard the palace full of voices, full of life, and realized it had been years. Even before the collapse, the palace had been more museum than home, more stage than living space. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said as they descended the stairs toward the garden entrance. His tone was careful, almost hesitant, which was unusual for him. "Of course. Why do you keep apologizing?" Aerith stopped walking. "What? You've apologized to me 14 times this week for the political situation, for the lack of formal duties, for my continued posting being a waste of my time." "Why?" "Because it is a waste of your time," Aerith said, confused that this even needed explanation. "You were assigned to guard a functioning head of state. Now you're babysitting a failed queen in an empty palace. That's not what you signed up for." Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying her with those steady brown eyes that always seemed to see more than she wanted to reveal. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am." "Always." "That's exactly why I'm staying." They sat in the gardens on a stone bench that overlooked the reflecting pool. The water was perfectly clear, maintained by automated systems that didn't care about political scandal or collapsed governments. Aerith stared at her reflection and tried to recognize the person looking back. "I don't understand," she finally said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since Marcus's cryptic comment. "I've served in 3 different systems," Marcus began, his voice thoughtful. "Guarded 5 different officials before this posting. Politicians, military commanders, corporate executives who'd negotiated security contracts. Every single one of them treated their guards like furniture, useful objects that exist to serve but don't merit actual consideration." He picked up a small stone and tossed it into the pool, watching ripples disturb the perfect reflection. "You learned my name the first day we met. Not just my rank, my actual name. You asked about my family, remembered details about my life, made conversation that treated me like I was a person rather than a security function. When I mentioned my sister was getting married, you asked about it for weeks until the wedding happened, then asked how it went. You noticed when I was tired or stressed and adjusted schedules to accommodate it." Aerith felt her ears flatten slightly with embarrassment. "That's just basic courtesy. That's what you think, but it's rarer than you realize, especially among people with power." Marcus turned to look at her directly. "Most powerful people only notice the people around them when those people fail at something. You notice people because you actually care about them. That's not common." "It clearly wasn't enough," Aerith said bitterly. "I cared about my advisors, trusted them, and they were stealing from the planet while I smiled and signed their documents like a trained pet. You were 20 years old when you inherited a throne you didn't ask for, surrounded by men decades older who told you to trust their expertise. That's not naivety. That's being deliberately deceived by people who exploited your trust." Marcus's voice was firm, almost angry on her behalf. "You didn't cause this corruption, Aerith. You inherited it." It was the first time he'd used her name without the title attached. The familiarity should have felt presumptuous, but instead it felt like relief, like being seen as a person rather than a failed institution. "The Parliament doesn't see it that way," Aerith said quietly. "They think I was either complicit or incompetent, maybe both. The Parliament is positioning themselves politically. They need you to be the villain so they can be the heroes who saved Thalraxis from royal corruption." Marcus threw another stone into the pool. "But political theater doesn't change the actual facts. You were betrayed by people you trusted. That's not your fault." "Then whose fault is it?" "The people who betrayed you," Marcus said simply. "Personal responsibility is apparently an old-fashioned concept, but I'm stubbornly attached to it." They sat in silence for a while, watching the automated fountain cycle through its patterns. Aerith felt something loosen in her chest, not quite hope, but maybe the absence of suffocating despair. "Why didn't you leave?" she asked finally. "I know the official answer about orders, but Marcus, be honest. You could have requested reassignment the moment the scandal broke. No one would have blamed you. This posting is essentially career suicide at this point. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than usual. When I was 19 and phenomenally stupid, I got in trouble during basic training. Insubordination, they called it, though honestly it was just me being an angry kid with authority issues. My commanding officer could have drummed me out, ended my military career before it started. But she looked at my record and said something I've never forgotten. I don't judge people by their worst moment. I judge them by what they do after. He turned to meet Aerith's eyes. You didn't cause this corruption, Aerith. But you faced the consequences honestly when you could have fled. You cooperated with investigations when you could have obstructed. You're trying to help clean up a mess you didn't create. That takes courage. And I don't abandon people just because their situation got difficult. That's not how I was raised. Aerith felt tears prick her eyes and fought them back. She'd cried enough this week. That's a nice principle, but you barely know me. 6 months isn't long enough to justify this kind of loyalty. 6 months is long enough to know character, Marcus countered. And your character is worth protecting. So unless you formally dismiss me, I'm staying. He paused, then added with slight awkwardness, besides, someone needs to make sure you actually eat meals. You've lost weight this week. Despite everything, Aerith laughed. You're absurd. I've been called worse. Marcus stood and offered his hand to help her up. Come on. The kitchens are mostly automated, but I can probably figure out how to make something edible. You're not facing another day on an empty stomach. Aerith took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. His grip was steady, warm, and entirely without judgment. For the first time in a week, she felt something other than crushing shame. Maybe she could survive this. Maybe, with one person who refused to abandon her, she could figure out who she was without a crown. Weeks became a month, then 2. The palace remained mostly empty, a monument to political collapse, but Aerith and Marcus developed routines that made the isolation bearable. They ate meals together in the small dining room rather than the formal hall designed for state dinners. They played strategy games Marcus taught her from Earth, chess and Go, and something called poker that involved significant amounts of bluffing. They walked the gardens daily, discussing everything except politics. Marcus told her about growing up on Kepler Station, a farming colony where everyone knew everyone else's business and privacy was more theoretical than actual. Aerith described the palace before it became her prison, when her parents were alive, and the halls were filled with actual joy rather than political theater. They talked about books they'd read, music they enjoyed, the small details of life that don't make history but make living bearable. And slowly, without either of them explicitly acknowledging it, the formal distance between them began to erode. Marcus still stood when she entered a room and still addressed her as ma'am in official contexts, but in private moments he was just Marcus, dry humor, unexpected kindness, and steady presence. One evening, while they were playing chess in the library, Aerith asked something she'd been wondering for weeks. Do you miss Earth? Marcus considered his next move before answering. Sometimes. I miss my family, my sister especially. She sends me messages about her baby, my nephew that I haven't met yet, but I don't miss Earth itself particularly. I've never been good at staying in one place. Is that why you joined the military? To avoid staying put? Partly. Marcus captured one of her pawns. Also because I was 19 and angry and needed structure before I did something really stupid. The military gave me purpose, taught me discipline, showed me parts of the galaxy I never would have seen otherwise. Do you regret it? The military? No, but I regret some things I've had to do in service of it. His expression darkened briefly. I've guarded people who didn't deserve protection, stayed silent about things I should have spoken up about, followed orders that made me uncomfortable. That's the compromise of military service. You agree to submerge your judgment to command authority. Usually that's fine. Sometimes it's not. Aerith moved her rook, then said quietly, You could have left when you realized I was one of those people who didn't deserve protection. That's not what I realized at all. Marcus's voice was firm. I realized you were one of the few people I've guarded who actually deserved the protection, but were surrounded by people who were exploiting that goodness. That's different. You have a remarkable ability to reframe my failures as virtues. I have a remarkable ability to recognize the difference between personal failure and systemic betrayal, Marcus corrected. You didn't fail. You were failed. The system failed you. Aerith wanted to argue, but the certainty in his voice made her pause. What if he was right? What if she'd been carrying shame for sins that weren't actually hers? The comm panel near the library entrance chimed, an official summons. Aerith's stomach clenched as she read the message. The emergency parliament wanted her testimony again, this time in public session. They wanted her to answer questions about her regent council's corruption before the entire planet. "They're going to eviscerate me," Aerith said, her voice hollow. "Turn me into a public spectacle to prove their legitimacy." Marcus read the summons over her shoulder. "Probably. Politicians love a good villain and you're convenient." He straightened. "But you don't have to face it alone. I'll accompany you as far as security allows. This isn't your fight." "It became my fight when I decided to stay," Marcus said simply. "You're not alone, Aerith. Whatever happens, you're not alone." The parliamentary testimony was exactly as brutal as Aerith had anticipated. 3 hours of questions designed to humiliate rather than illuminate. Implications that she was either complicit or incompetent. And a gallery full of citizens who'd come to watch the fall of their failed queen. "Did you not think to verify the financial reports? Why didn't you question the military assessments? How could you sign these documents without understanding their implications?" Each question was a knife, precisely aimed to demonstrate her inadequacy. Aerith answered as honestly as she could, admitting her trust, her naivety, her failure to see the deception happening under her authority. She didn't defend herself because there was no defense that wouldn't sound like excuse-making. When they finally dismissed her, Aerith walked from the parliamentary hall with as much dignity as she could maintain, aware of hundreds of eyes watching her every step. Marcus was waiting outside, as he'd promised, and his presence was the only thing that kept her from breaking down immediately. They didn't speak during the transport back to the palace. They didn't speak through the empty corridors or up the stairs to her quarters. But when they reached her private sitting room, one of the few spaces that still felt like hers, Aerith finally let herself fall apart completely. She collapsed onto the sofa and sobbed with the kind of raw, ugly grief that had no dignity attached to it. Everything she'd been holding back for weeks poured out in broken sounds that echoed through empty rooms. Her parents were dead, her government was destroyed, her reputation was ruined, and she was alone in a palace that felt like a tomb to everything her family had built over 800 years. Marcus didn't tell her it would be okay. He didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. He just sat beside her and waited, present without demanding anything, until the storm finally passed. When Aerith could breathe again, when the tears finally slowed, she raised her head to find Marcus still there, patient and steady. "I'm sorry," she managed. "That was unprofessional." "You're allowed to be human, well, Thalraxian," Marcus said gently. "You're allowed to hurt when people are cruel. That doesn't make you weak, Aerith, it makes you honest." "I feel weak." "Because our culture confuses emotional honesty with weakness," Marcus replied. "But it takes more strength to feel pain and continue forward than to shut down and pretend nothing affects you. You're one of the strongest people I've met." Aerith wanted to believe him, but the day had carved out whatever reserve of strength she'd maintained. What if they're right? What if I was incompetent? Then you were incompetent in the service of trying to help people, which is better than being competent in the service of exploiting them. Marcus's voice was firm. But you weren't incompetent. You were 20 years old, suddenly ruling a planet, surrounded by experienced advisors who deliberately deceived you. That's not incompetence. That's being the victim of calculated manipulation. He stood and moved to the small kitchen area, returning with water and something that might have been Thalraxian comfort food, though Aerith wasn't sure how he'd learned to prepare it. "Eat," he said, not unkindly. "Rest. Tomorrow we'll face whatever comes next, but tonight you're allowed to just exist without performing strength for anyone." Aerith took the food and realized with startling clarity that Marcus had become the only person in the universe who saw her as a person rather than a symbol. Not a queen, not a scandal, not a political opportunity, just Aerith, a young woman trying to survive impossible circumstances. That realization terrified and comforted her in equal measure. Because if she was just Aerith, then who was she without the crown she'd never really worn successfully? Marcus seemed to read her thoughts. "You're figuring that out," he said quietly. "Who you are when all the roles are stripped away. It's terrifying, but it's also freedom. Most people spend their whole lives trapped in roles they didn't choose. You're getting the chance to choose who you actually want to be. I don't know who that is." "Then we'll figure it out together," Marcus said simply. "One day at a time." And somehow, sitting in an empty palace with one human soldier who'd chosen to stay when everyone else fled, Aerith felt the first fragile stirring of something that might become hope. The emergency parliament announced their decision 3 months after the scandal broke: full dissolution of the monarchy and establishment of a democratic republic. Princess-Queen Aerith would be granted a modest pension and allowed to live quietly as a private citizen, but the ancient bloodline that had ruled Thalraxis for 800 years would end with her. Most of the planet celebrated. Aerith watched from her window as fireworks lit the sky, heard the sounds of street parties drifting up from the capital below. They were celebrating her family's end, the destruction of everything her ancestors had built, and she felt both grief and strange relief. Grief for the loss, for the weight of history ending, but relief that she wouldn't have to carry this impossible burden anymore, that she could finally stop pretending to be something she'd never been equipped to be. "How are you holding up?" Marcus asked from the doorway. He'd taken to checking on her more frequently as the announcement approached, as if sensing she needed the reminder that someone still saw her. "I'm not sure," Aerith admitted. "Is it terrible that part of me feels relieved? It's human, well, sentient." Marcus entered the room and stood beside her at the window, watching the celebrations below. "You've been carrying weight that was never yours to carry alone. Being relieved that it's over doesn't mean you didn't care. It means you're honest enough to acknowledge when something is impossible." They stood in silence, watching her kingdom, former kingdom, celebrate its freedom from her family's rule. After a moment, Marcus said quietly, "The Parliament is arranging your relocation to a smaller residence outside the capital, modest but comfortable. You'll have privacy there, some distance from the political center." "And you?" Aerith asked, not looking at him. "Your posting officially ends now, doesn't it?" "Technically ended 3 weeks ago," Marcus replied. "I've been on extended volunteer assignment since then." Aerith turned to face him, surprise breaking through her melancholy. "What?" "I requested extended leave to help with your transition. If you want the help, that is. I thought you might need someone who knows you, who can help you adjust to civilian life without the pressure of royal obligations." "Marcus, you can't just volunteer your military leave for me. You have family, you have a life." "I have a choice," Marcus interrupted gently, "and I'm choosing to stay if you'll have me. Not as your guard anymore, since there's nothing left to guard. Just as someone who'd like to help you figure out who you are when you're not trying to be a queen." Aerith felt her eyes fill with tears. Again, always again, she'd cried more in 3 months than in the previous 20 years combined. Why would you sacrifice your time, your career advancement, for someone who has nothing left to offer?" Marcus stepped closer, and his voice was tender when he spoke. "Because when I was 19 and scared I'd ruined my life, someone gave me a second chance to figure out who I wanted to be. Because you're not someone who has nothing to offer. You're Aerith, a person who deserves support and friendship and the space to discover herself without performance pressure. And because—" He hesitated, then continued, "because somewhere in the last few months, Guarding you stopped being a duty and became something I wanted to do. Not because you're a queen, but because you're you." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and significant. Aerith understood what he wasn't quite saying, what she'd been feeling herself but couldn't name while the power imbalance was so stark. "I don't know who I am without the crown," Aerith said softly. "I don't know if the person underneath is someone worth knowing." "Then let's find out," Marcus replied. "Together if you're willing. No obligations, no royal protocols, no duty binding us. Just two people figuring out life in whatever form it takes next." Aerith looked at this human soldier who'd stayed when everyone else fled, who'd seen her at her worst and chosen to remain, who treated her collapse not as failure but as transformation. She thought about the empty palace, the celebrations outside, the strange, terrifying freedom of having nothing left to lose. "Okay," she said. "Together." 6 months later, Aerith lived in a small residence on the outskirts of the capital, far enough from the political center to feel anonymous but close enough to access the city when needed. Her pension was modest but adequate. Her days were her own for the first time since her parents died. No ceremonies, no obligations, no performance required. Marcus had stayed, taking a civilian position as a cultural liaison between Earth and Thalraxis, work that kept him on planet but gave him actual free time. They'd fallen into a life that felt almost normal, cooking meals together, exploring the city as anonymous citizens, building something that wasn't quite romance yet but held its possibility. One evening, sitting on the small balcony of her new home and watching the sunset paint the sky in colors she'd never had time to appreciate before, Aerith said, "I got a message from the Parliament today." Marcus looked up from the book he was reading. "Oh, they want to establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, public testimony about the corruption, investigation into what happened, clearing the historical record." Aerith paused. "They want me to participate. How do you feel about that?" "Terrified," Aerith admitted. "But also, maybe ready, I don't know. It would mean facing all of it again, every failure and betrayal. But it would also mean setting the record straight, making sure people understand what actually happened rather than just the political narrative." Marcus set his book aside. "Do you want to do it?" "I think so. Not for them and not to rehabilitate my reputation, but for me, to speak my truth even if no one believes it, to refuse to let my story be written entirely by people who weren't there." She looked at him. "Would you be there if I did this?" "Every session if you want me," Marcus said without hesitation. "Not as your guard since you don't need one, just as someone who believes your story deserves to be heard." Aerith felt warmth spread through her chest, gratitude and affection and something deeper that she was finally brave enough to name. "Marcus, I know," he said gently, reaching for her hand. "I know, Aerith. And when you're ready, when you're sure, when the power imbalance feels resolved enough that you trust your own feelings." He smiled. "I'll still be here. You're impossibly patient." "I'm impossibly in love with you," Marcus corrected. "Which makes patience relatively easy." Aerith laughed, the sound surprised and genuine. When had she last laughed like that? Before her parents died, probably. Before she became a queen she was never equipped to be. But she wasn't a queen anymore. She was just Aerith, figuring out who that meant, discovering herself in the spaces between political disaster and unexpected grace. She had no power, no title, no crown to mark her as special. But she had Marcus, who'd stayed when everyone else left. She had possibility stretching before her like unwritten pages. She had the freedom to choose who she wanted to become. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for staying. For seeing me when I was invisible to everyone else. For believing I was worth protecting even when I couldn't protect myself." "You've always been worth protecting," Marcus said simply. "The world just took a while to catch up to what I saw immediately." They sat together as evening deepened into night, two people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and chosen each other when all the political necessity fell away. Aerith had lost everything she'd been taught to value: power, position, legacy. But she'd found something better, the freedom to be herself, and someone who loved that self without reservation. Sometimes, she thought, losing everything is just another word for finding what actually matters. And what mattered was sitting beside her, reading his book in comfortable silence, choosing her company over everything else the galaxy had to offer. That was worth more than any crown.